When we started working together, nothing felt temporary. The days repeated themselves in a way that made time feel slower, heavier, almost reliable. We knew the rhythm of the place, the quiet moments between tasks, the sound of the room when everyone else had already left. He was there before me most mornings, and I stayed longer most nights. Somewhere in between, we became friends. Not the kind that share secrets, but the kind that don't need to explain themselves. She arrived during a season that didn't feel important at the time. Not a turning point, not a beginning, just another moment that blended into everything else. She came to stay with me, to live in the small space I had learned to call home. Felt natural, comfortable, like something that had already been decided long before either of us noticed. A few weeks later, she started working with us too. Same shifts, same breaks, same long hours that slowly blur the line between professional and personal. He lived nearby, close enough that we would run into each other even when we weren't trying to. Close enough that our lives overlapped without effort. He had a girlfriend too, someone from another country, someone who existed mostly through phone calls and occasional visits. It never felt solid, but it never felt broken either. Just distant, like something that worked only because no one looked at it too closely. First, everything felt balanced. We laughed together. We shared meals after work. The three of us moved through the days like a small, accidental unit, formed not by intention, but by convenience. I never questioned it. I never felt the need to protect anything. Trust didn't feel like a choice back then, it felt like the default. The change didn't announce itself. It never does. One evening, he mentioned it casually, as if he were talking about the weather. He had ended things. Over the phone. No details. No emotion in his voice. Just a fact delivered and then left behind. I nodded, said something neutral, something appropriate. She reacted differently. She listened. She asked questions. She stayed with him longer that night. I noticed it, but I didn't mark it as important. Support doesn't look dangerous when you believe in people. Days passed. Then weeks. The rhythm of work stayed the same, but something underneath it shifted. Conversations that used to include me now happened slightly out of reach. Nothing obvious. Nothing dramatic. Just small moments where I realized I hadn't heard the end of a story, or where laughter arrived before I did. I told myself this was normal, that I was imagining patterns because that's what the mind does when it's tired. I trusted them both, and because of that, I trusted myself less. The first time I saw them, I didn't understand what I was looking at. It was late. The street was quiet. They stood close, closer than people usually stand when nothing is happening. There was no urgency, no guilt in their posture. Just familiarity. I paused for a moment, long enough to register the scene, then walked past it, carrying the image with me like something unfinished. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't ask questions. I didn't even allow myself to name the feeling. The second time wasn't an accident. I recognized the way he leaned toward her, the ease with which she didn't step away. I stood where I couldn't be seen, watching a truth I wasn't ready to accept unfold without me. It wasn't betrayal in the way people imagine it. Sudden, explosive, undeniable. It was quiet, slow, almost gentle, and that made it worse. By the time she told me she was leaving, I already knew. There was nothing left to explain. No apology would have changed anything. She came to me once, and she left with him later, and somewhere in between, I became a background detail in my own life. We didn't stop working together immediately. Life rarely allows for clean endings. We continued to share the same spaces, the same routines, pretending that familiarity hadn't turned into distance. Then, one by one, we all left. Different cities, different countries, different versions of ourselves. No dramatic farewell, just absence. For a long time after, I punished myself quietly. Not with anger, but with questions. With replayed moments. With the constant thought that if I had noticed earlier, spoken sooner, acted differently, maybe things would have ended another way. I carried that weight without showing it, convincing myself that responsibility and blame were the same thing. They moved on together. I moved on alone. And the hardest part wasn't losing her. It was realizing how easily I had stepped aside without knowing I was doing it. After she left, the days didn't collapse the way I expected them to. Nothing broke dramatically. No walls fell. No routines disappeared overnight. Life continued with an almost offensive calm, as if what had happened was too small to matter. I woke up, went to work, answered questions, completed tasks. The world didn't slow down for my confusion. It never does. What changed was quieter. I became more aware of spaces, of chairs that stayed empty longer than they should have, of conversations that ended too quickly, of silence that followed me from room to room like a shadow that refused to detach. I noticed how often my mind returned to the same moments, replaying them with a precision that felt cruel. Not because I wanted answers, but because I wanted to understand where exactly I had stopped being necessary. We still worked together for a while. There was an unspoken agreement between us. No explanations, no confrontations, no need to acknowledge what had already been decided. They didn't avoid me, and I didn't move closer. We existed in the same environment like strangers who shared a memory they both preferred not to touch. I watched them carefully then, not out of jealousy, but out of disbelief. They moved with the ease of people who no longer question their place beside one another. The kind of closeness that doesn't need reassurance. I wondered how long that had been forming while I was present, smiling, trusting, unaware that I was slowly being replaced by comfort. I didn't hate him. That surprised me more than anything else. Hatred would have been simpler. It would have given shape to the pain, a direction to point it in. Instead, I felt something closer to disappointment. Not in him, but in myself. I kept thinking about how naturally I had allowed everything to happen. How I had mistaken calm for safety. How I had believed that loyalty, once given, protected itself. Some nights, I walked past his place without intending to. I told myself it was coincidence, that the route made sense, that I was just tired. Once or twice I saw the light on. Once, I heard laughter through an open window. It didn't hurt in the way I expected it to. It felt distant, like listening to a story that no longer belonged to me. What hurt was the waiting. Waiting for clarity. Waiting for anger. Waiting for the moment when I would finally feel something sharp enough to cut through the fog. But it never came. Instead, there was only this slow realization that nothing had been stolen from me. I had simply stepped aside without realizing anyone was asking me to move. When we eventually left the job, it didn't feel symbolic at first. Resignations were handed in quietly. Plans were made without shared excitement. One by one, we disconnected from the place that had held us together long enough for everything to fall apart. They moved to another city. I chose another country. Distance did what confrontation never did. It ended things completely. In the new place, everything was unfamiliar. New streets, new voices, new routines that demanded attention. For a while, I thought the change had worked. That movement alone was enough to loosen the grip of the past. But memory doesn't care where you are. It waits. It follows. It resurfaces in moments you don't expect. During a quiet train ride, in the middle of a conversation, late at night when your mind has nothing else to hold on to. I punished myself then, but not loudly. There was no dramatic self-destruction, no visible collapse. Just a constant internal negotiation. I questioned every decision I had made in that time, every silence, Every moment I chose comfort over curiosity. I wondered whether I had been naive or simply unwilling to see what was forming right in front of me. Sometimes I imagined confronting them, not to accuse but to ask, to hear them say when it started, how it felt, whether there had been a moment of hesitation. But those conversations never happened. Not because they were impossible, but because they no longer mattered. Answers lose their power when you realize they wouldn't change the outcome. What stayed with me was the feeling of being slowly erased. Not violently, not intentionally, just gently replaced by something easier. I learned then that betrayal doesn't always announce itself as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives disguised as understanding, patience, and shared silence. I began to see my role more clearly. I wasn't wronged because I trusted. I wasn't foolish because I believed. But I was careless with my own presence. I assumed that being there was enough, that consistency guaranteed importance. It doesn't. Nothing does. As time passed, the memory softened, but it didn't disappear. It became less about them and more about the version of myself I no longer wanted to be, the one who watches quietly, hoping that loyalty will protect him from loss. I carried that lesson with me not as a rule, but as an awareness. She came to me, she left with him, and I stayed long enough to learn what it means to be slowly left behind. Time did what I couldn't. It didn't explain anything, didn't justify what had happened, didn't soften the truth into something easier to accept. It simply created distance, not just between places, but between who I was then and who I slowly became afterward. Days turned into months, months into years, and the memory of them settled somewhere deep, no longer sharp, but never entirely silent. We never spoke again, not because there was anger left to express, but because the version of us that existed back then no longer had a place in our lives. They moved forward together, building something that didn't include me. I moved alone, carrying pieces of that time without knowing where to put them. We didn't owe each other explanations anymore. Silence had already said enough. In the beginning, I blamed myself relentlessly. Not in the dramatic way people imagine guilt, but in quiet moments when nothing distracted me. I replayed conversations I had dismissed, moments I had ignored, instincts I had silenced because I wanted to believe that trust was stronger than doubt. I convinced myself that awareness would have changed everything, that seeing earlier meant saving something. Over time, I understood how unfair that assumption was. Some things don't break because you failed to protect them. They break because they were never meant to stay whole. I learned to recognize the difference between responsibility and self-punishment. Responsibility is acknowledging where you stood, what you allowed, what you chose not to question. Self-punishment is believing that every outcome was yours to prevent. I lived in that confusion for a long time, mistaking reflection for control, thinking that understanding the past meant I could rewrite it. Couldn't. What I could do was stop measuring my worth by how easily I had been replaced. I could stop asking myself why I wasn't enough, why my presence faded so quietly, why loyalty didn't protect me the way I thought it would. Those questions led nowhere. They never do. What mattered was learning how to stay present without disappearing, how to trust without abandoning myself in the process. There were moments when the memory returned unexpectedly. A familiar street, a shared joke overheard in passing, a certain tone of voice that reminded me of a time when everything still felt intact. Those moments no longer hurt the way they once did. They felt distant, like echoes of a life that belonged to someone else. I acknowledged them and let them pass, no longer chasing closure where none was waiting. I stopped thinking of it as a betrayal, not because it wasn't one, but because that word no longer captured the complexity of what had happened. It wasn't a single decision or a sudden shift. It was a gradual movement, a series of small choices that aligned without intention until they created something irreversible. No one planned it. No one stopped it either. She came to me during a time when everything felt stable. She left with him when that stability no longer existed. And I stayed behind long enough to understand that endings don't always arrive with clarity or justice. Sometimes they simply arrive with distance. We all went our separate ways. Different cities, different countries, different versions of ourselves shaped by the same moment we experienced differently. I carried mine quietly, allowing it to change me without defining me. I didn't come out stronger in the way stories like to promise. I came out more aware, and that was enough. I don't regret trusting them. I regret how easily I ignored myself. Some stories don't end with apologies. They end with understanding. And that was mine. Some stories don't end with apologies. They end with understanding. If the story felt familiar, you're not alone. Thank you for listening. This was Block Tales.